Hi, and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to talk about Roderick Farrell and how he ended up taking two innocent lives and then proceeded to be on the run with his vampire group before eventually being caught. The trigger warnings for today are animal abuse, self-harm, drug abuse, mention of blood, as well as murder. So without any further ado, let's get on to the video. Roderick Justin Farrell was born on the 28th of March in 1980 in Mary, Kentucky to his mother Sandra Gibson and his father Rick Farrell. His parents met in high school, and about 2 years into them dating, Sandra, at 16 years old, fell pregnant. So the couple decided to go ahead and get married, but unfortunately the marriage didn't last long. So Sandra and Rick would get a divorce. And after Rick left to join the military, Sandra was left to raise Roderick all by herself. Unfortunately though, Sandra struggled a lot with her mental health issues and would work as a sex worker to try and earn some money. Over time she would date and also marry a lot of different men. So Roderick would grow up with different people around him, not really having any kind of stability in his life. The Ferrell family also moved around over the years, and Roderick would say that his mother was a monster when her anger got the better of her, but that he still loved her. And also Roderick claimed that his grandfather abused him when he was still very young. Once Roderick turned 12 years old, he started to develop an obsession with dark stuff, as well as vampires, which was inspired by his mother Sandra, who was also an enthusiast about vampires. His mother showed him a role-playing video game called Masquerade, which surprisingly plays a vampire. And once Roderick started to play this game, he was completely taken into this world. Roderick would go on and claim that he was a 500-year-old vampire by the name of Visago, which was the character's name. So basically Roderick was so into this game that this eventually became his reality. And Visago was some kind of ninth prince of hell who had the ability to see into the future. And considering his life at home, he really threw himself into this vampire world to the point where there would be only vampire themes that would have been interesting for him. He would spend his whole time reading, watching, everything and anything regarding vampires. And eventually Roderick started to collect different weapons to terrorize the neighborhood cats. But eventually, as his anger and destruction kept rising, he turned it on himself. One night his mom Sandra walked into his room to find her son with a razor blade in his hand. And Roderick had cut himself all the way from his belly button to his throat. Sandra, obviously terrified by the sight of her son bleeding profusely, but to Roderick, he was fascinated by the way his blood looked going down his body. And his behavior kept on escalating because soon after this incident, Sandra would start finding hard drugs. In fact, Roderick was so into his own world that his whole bedroom was filled with crosses hanging upside down, broken pieces of glass, and just random weapons spread around his room. And this all eventually became too much for Sandra. She did say that she tried her best to get her son the help that he needed, but Roderick just kept on refusing. So at one point, Sandra was just at her breaking point. She couldn't deal with her son anymore, so Roderick went on to live with a friend of his called Jaden and his family. Roderick and Jaden had met each other at their high school in 1995. It is said that when they met, both of them saw each other more like an enemy than a friend. Jaden would wear a dark cloak and combat boots, and he was the leader of a teenage vampire group. So once Roderick came into the picture, he was quite similar to Jaden. He would also wear dark trench coats, same combat boots, so Jaden felt like Roderick was entering into his territory. But eventually, after talking and getting to know the group better, they became friends and bonded over their interests in the darker parts of life. And in January in 1969, Roderick became an official member after going through a ceremony that the group called crossing over. Jaden took Roderick to the Salem cemetery, to a single tree where the other members had previously crossed over in order to become new vampires. At this tree, Jaden put out a razor blade, which he handed over to Roderick, who then proceeded to cut into his left shoulder 3 times. So as the blood started to run down Roderick's body, Jaden started to drink from his wound until the bleeding eventually stopped. And then Jaden made a cut to himself, from which Roderick then started drinking. So basically the boys exchanged their blood under this tree, because to this group, blood exchange was the highest form of commitment. If you exchanged your blood with the members, there was no going back after this. After the ritual was finished, Roderick was now an official member, and as a member he had some rules that he needed to follow. And these rules were that first he had to pledge total loyalty and obedience. And the second rule was that he had to put the needs of the vampire clan before anything else. And as far as I know, that were the rules. Not many, but the message was clear. You are now a member of us, and therefore we as a group come first. As more and more members started joining the group, the members became the center of attention regarding the gossip at their school. It started to go around about the blood ceremonies, the drugs, sex rituals, and as the rumors kept spreading, Jaden and Roderick quickly became almost famous. Not only at their school, but in the town of Murray. And Murray is known to be a religious town where many people would consider to retire and settle down. So this group of vampires now, I'm sure you can imagine how the people were reacting. But for the members of the Vampire Club, this was more of a compliment than an insult. The group had their own rules and beliefs and just didn't care what other people thought of them. For example, the vampire law forbids murder, as the members know that the human life is sacred, but in order to achieve immortality, drinking blood is necessary. This group was a family where they would have the elders, and whoever joined in, they received different names. For example, the members Scott, Stephen, Vanessa, and a different Stephen received the names of Gabriel, Jaden, Angelic, and Raven. I've mentioned before that there were also sex rituals, and Roderick was also getting intimate with different girls from the group, and because of that they saw themselves to be more superior. Roderick started to even claim that he had supernatural powers, such as mind reading, and as time went on, the friendship between Roderick and Jaden became even stronger, that eventually Roderick had let his guard down and started to show Jaden who he truly was. One day the boys were walking around a trailer park where Roderick came across a baby kitten. And he picked the baby kitten up and started petting it, but this kitten just became scared and scratched Roderick across his arm, which angered him so much so that he slammed this poor baby kitten into the ground and pressed it into the dirt, and the baby kitten cried out for help. As Roderick looked around, he saw a tree trunk, and that's when he picked the baby kitten up by its neck and slammed it against the tree, breaking its spiral cord, killing this poor kitten in the process. Jaden just watched in horror as his friend killed a defenseless animal and laughed while doing so. Jaden knew in that moment that this was the end for their friendship. Jaden, unlike Roderick, never thought of hurting animals, nor was he interested in joining in. But as for Roderick, it wasn't anywhere near enough, and he was starting to become sick and tired of Jaden's morals. On the 13th of October in 1969, a group of people broke into a sanctuary, and the intruders opened each cage and set the bigger dogs free. The smaller puppies, though, were taken into the field next to the sanctuary, where the intruders started to cut the limbs off of the puppies and slit their throats. And as the puppies were dying, they were held over each other as their blood kept pouring over another. and then proceeded to take a blood bath and also drinking from the blood. The next morning, one of the workers arrived at the sanctuary just to notice the older dogs walking around the driveway. And as this worker kept looking around, that's when she saw the horrific scene. Just outside the fence is where the worker came across the bodies of the blood-drained dead puppies. In the meantime, Jaden and Roderick's friendship really started to crumble, as one night Jaden and one of his friends called Bones went to Roderick's home, and as soon as Roderick saw them arriving, he walked outside of his home whilst his mother Sandra stood from the screen door. The tension was already high, and during their conversation, both Jaden and Roderick threatened to murder each other. It escalated to the point where Jaden ended up grabbing Roderick by his throat and pinning him against the side of his house. As Jaden kept tightening his grip around Roderick's neck, he slowly started to turn blue, and realizing that he might really take his life then and there, Jaden released his grip. Sandra, at that point, had also ran outside screaming at Jaden that he was obsessed with controlling her son Roderick, to which Jaden just replied that no one was able to control her son, not even herself. And after this altercation, the vampire group basically banned Roderick from the group, and Roderick didn't take this lightly at all, as he began to take even more drugs. Roderick knew that he needed to make new friends in order to start a new vampire clan. His vampire clan. A boy named Michael Schaefer, who Roderick had helped in crossing over in order to join the vampire family. And once Roderick reached out to Michael, he left the vampire clan to join Roderick in starting a new family. And with Michael joining in, others started to join Roderick's clan as well. The following members were Charlotte Casey, who was actually Roderick's girlfriend. She was 16 years old. Then there is Dana Cooper, who was 19 years old, and Scott Anderson, who was also 16 years old. And they all had something in common, since they all came from unstable households. Now, with this new group, it felt like the family that none of them ever had. Now, with Roderick as the leader, Scott kind of became his right-handed man, and he really looked up to Roderick, because he kept on encouraging him to just live outside of society's expectations. And when they would all hang around, their fantasies would always be about killing people. It was mostly for fun. They weren't actually planning murder, but as for Roderick, this wasn't a fantasy, but more of a slow-building plan. Roderick had secretly been staying in contact with his ex-girlfriend Heather Wendorf. Heather lived with her parents Naomi and Richard, and her sister Jennifer in Eustis, Florida. But over time, the relationship with her family just started to go south. And the more she confided in Roderick about how miserable she was at home, he felt like he needed to do something about it. Heather got into a lot of fights with her sister Jennifer, who was just living her teenage years. Jennifer was in the cheer team, and she had also recently received a new car. And she's also described to be very intelligent and pretty. Jennifer had also earned herself a scholarship to the Florida State University. So she definitely knew what she wanted to accomplish in life, and she worked hard to reach her goals. As for her parents, Naomi and Richard are described as the typical suburban parents, where they were known around the neighborhood, everyone knew and liked. Richard worked as a warehouse manager for a bottling company, and his wife Naomi, who actually liked to be called the Roof, she was a stay-at-home mom and would often help out at her daughter's school. So to the outside world, this family really looked like the perfect family next door, but Heather was always different from the rest. Heather is described to be a free spirit and rebellious, unlike her sister Jennifer. She wore grungy clothing, dyed her hair black, and also expressed herself a lot through her art, where she would oftentimes paint dark creatures who were supposed to resemble herself. It is said that not only were teachers concerned about her behavior, but Heather would also get into fist fights with her parents, and I can only assume Jennifer as well. And her parents didn't really know what to do anymore. All Richard and Ruth knew was that their daughter was becoming angry and depressed, and they had a feeling that Heather was hanging around the wrong crowd. Heather and Roderick first met in their sophomore years in Eustis High School. And Roderick was in Eustis because his mother Sandra had met a boyfriend and gotten married. So Roderick basically just had to move with them. So the two of them met and instantly became best friends. They would spend a lot of nights just hanging around the cemetery or sneaking into mausoleums. And it was the fact that Roderick was that different that drew Heather towards him. One day Jennifer actually asked him why he liked his sword so much, to which Roderick just replied, "You don't see much cats around here now, do you?" And Heather was really smitten by him. She just loved this darkness and edginess, and they soon started dating. But because Roderick eventually moved back to Murray due to the fact that his mother's marriage didn't last, the relationship between him and Heather was also broken up. But nonetheless, Roderick promised to stay in contact, and they would spend hours and hours on the phone, filling each other in on their lives. They talked as often as they could, but because they talked to each other that much, Heather's parents actually received a phone bill over $850, and they told their daughter that she needed to find another way to stay in touch with Roderick. So they started writing letters to one another where Heather would talk about just how miserable she was and that her parents were abusive towards her. And Roderick is already fantasizing about murdering someone. So now that he reads Heather's letters, his fantasy starts to drift to murdering her parents in order to rescue her. Scott, Roderick's right-handed man, said that he believed that Heather was being sexually abused by her father, and that her mother knew about it but just didn't bother to step in. And there was never any evidence of sexual abuse. So we don't know if there is any truth to it or not, but I did want to mention those allegations. Now, with all these allegations, Roderick in his mind had the perfect excuse to execute his plan. And he even managed to convince his vampire family to pack up and move with him to Eustis. And they did just that. But only Scott, Charity and Dana drove to Eustis because Sandra put her son into a treatment center for troubled children just a few days before they intended to leave. So he had to come to a later date. Now, once the clan arrived, Roderick called up Heather and asked if she wanted to join the family. And so she gave him her address and told him to come pick her up. On the 25th of November in 1969, Roderick and his friends picked up Heather in the evening, and they all drove to the local cemetery where Roderick and Heather would wander off for about an hour, where they would take a blood oath by cutting their arms with a razor blade, pouring their blood into a cup and then drinking from it. It was important for Roderick that before he went on with his plans, that he and Heather bonded over blood. But before they returned, Roderick also took dragonfly acid as the crew drove back to Heather's house. Scott's car, though, had already had a lot of problems, and it even broke down on the way to Florida. So Heather mentioned that her dad had a Ford Explorer, which Scott could steal, but that the keys were in her parents' bedroom, so they would need to break into the house. So Heather, Dana and Charity stayed inside the car, as Roderick and Scott made their way into the house of Heather's parents, where Richard and his wife Ruth enjoyed their evening together like any other night. Roderick and Scott broke into the garage, which was connected to the house, where they came across a blue Ford Explorer. Roderick started to look around the garage to see if he could find any type of weapon. There was an axe and a chainsaw, but neither of these weapons really spoke to Roderick, as he found a crowbar that he picked up. And as they made their way through the garage, they came across the door, which wasn't locked, so they could just walk right inside. The boys agreed that Scott would go after Heather's mother, and Roger would take care of Richard, who hasn't noticed someone entering because he was watching TV at full volume. As Scott went upstairs to look for the keys, Roderick already had made up his plan as he slowly went into the living room, standing behind Richard, waiting for the right moment. Scott saw what his friend was about to do and just stood frozen on the stairs and watched in horror as his grip tightened on the crowbar. And just as Richard noticed someone standing behind him, Roderick slammed the crowbar onto Richard's head. The blood splattered everywhere, the couch, curtains, even onto Roderick's face and clothes. This robbery had just turned into a murder scene, and whilst Roderick took the life of Richard, Scott knew that he wasn't able to kill Heather's mother. And as soon as Roderick was done, he pushed past Scott and just started to search for the key to the Ford Explorer. But just as he walked into the kitchen, he bumped into Ruth. She happened to have a cup of coffee in her hands, and as soon as she saw Roderick, she threw her cup of boiling coffee across his chest, burning him completely. Ruth then threw herself towards Roderick, trying to scratch his face, but Roderick was fighting back as he got his hands on the crowbar again, smashing it across her head, shattering her skull. He kept on bashing in Ruth's skull until she had a giant hole in the back of her head, and by now Roderick was soaked in blood, as was the kitchen. After taking the life of Richard and Ruth, he went into the bedroom where he took a pearl necklace and an antique knife and the keys to the Ford Explorer before heading outside. Charity, Dana and Heather watched as Roderick and Scott came outside of the house. Roderick smiled as veins splashed from his neck, and with absolutely no hesitation whatsoever or even questioning him, everyone got into the car and started to drive around a few blocks. After switching the car, Roderick was screaming and laughing as the adrenaline and the LSD that he took prior to the murder was still kicking in. Heather's sister Jennifer came home around 10 p.m., but she was past her curfew, so she had to sneak into the house to avoid getting into trouble. But as she was entering the dark living room, she saw her dad on the couch with the TV running, who looked like he fell asleep. So she quietly went into the kitchen where she had the shock of her life as she saw the whole kitchen covered in blood and her mother's dead body spread across the floor. And as she ran back into the living room, that's when Jennifer realized that her father was also dead. Jennifer immediately called 911, and as they started investigating the bodies, the officer noticed that Ruth's head was bashed in so hard that fragments of her skull were found in the next room. The officers also noticed that Heather was missing, and so was the car. So she immediately became the main suspect. The police found an abandoned car which had Richard's tags on it. But they knew that this wasn't the car that they were looking for. And this said car was actually registered to Scott Anderson. So now they had a name and also knew what kind of car they were looking for. And in the meantime, Roderick's plan was to go to New Orleans, which he called the City of Vampires. He wanted to start fresh in a city where he felt like he belonged to. But there was also a lot of tension during the car ride, as the rest of the group just sat and watched Roderick in horror. And Heather just couldn't stop but bawling her eyes out. On their way to New Orleans, the group made a lot of stops. At one stop, Roderick changed his clothes and got rid of his blood-covered clothes. Then they filled the car up with gas and got themselves some food. After a few days on the road, Roderick started to become paranoid that the police were onto him. And in fact, he was pulled over on 5 different occasions. But somehow he was always able to talk himself out of every situation. But because Roderick had started to lose control and became even more anxious by being pulled over so many times, he decided to take a stop at Louisiana, where he tossed the crowbar into the Mississippi River. With one problem gone, a new one arose because the group started to run out on gas and money. So that's when Roderick's girlfriend Charity mentioned that her mom might have some money that they could borrow. So after thinking it through, Charity called her mom using a local payphone. But it wasn't her mother that picked up, but her grandmother. So Charity asked for money from her grandmother, who was very concerned about her granddaughter, so she agreed and told her to meet her at the Howard Johnson's motel in Baton Rouge. On the 28th of November, so 3 days after the murder on Heather's parents, the police who were working with Charity's grandmother set up a trap at the Howard Johnson's motel. The police was already waiting in the parking lot for the crew to arrive, and as soon as Scott parked the car, they were surrounded by several squads with flashing lights. They were all immediately arrested, but for some reason Roderick and Charity didn't really seem to care all that much, as there is a video footage of them making out with each other in the cell. The group was transferred back to Florida, and that's when the real interrogation started. Heather immediately said that she had no idea what Roderick was planning, and that she thought that he and Scott would only steal the keys to the car, not commit a double murder. Heather goes on to say that she even told Roderick to not go near her parents. Eventually the police got a confession out of Roderick, because he thought by confessing to murder of Heather's parents that the rest would be released, but that wasn't the case. Charity, Dana and Scott all admitted that they knew about Roderick's plan, and that Scott was even set to kill Ruth, but that he just wasn't able to. Roderick Farrell was charged with armed robbery, armed burglary and 2 counts of first-degree murder. And media spread like wildfire about this vampire clan ruled by drugs and blood, and the whole nation was shocked and disgusted by what had happened, that people soon started to talk about possible death sentence for Roderick. The trial began in 1989, and during the trial is where Roderick would see his father again, who was in court for only 1 day, but he didn't speak to his son at all. And whilst testifying, Rick would only refer to Roderick as the child. He would never use his name or refer to him as his son. And after the hearing was over, it is said that Roderick went back into his cell and cried. Roderick intentionally pled not guilty, but the evidence was just too strong, so his lawyer eventually changed his strategy, and on the 12th of February in 1989, Roderick Farrell pledged guilty in hope of avoiding the death penalty. And just a quick reminder that Roderick is 16 years old at the time that he committed the murder, and his lawyer also tried arguing that Roderick wasn't mentally stable since he was diagnosed with schizotypal personality disorder. So they tried to use that, but it just wasn't enough, and Roderick Justin Farrell was convicted of the murder of Richard and Ruth, and he was sentenced to death, making him the youngest person on death row in Florida. Scott Anderson, who also pledged guilty to avoid the death penalty, was convinced as principal in first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Charity was convicted of 2 counts of third-degree murder, robbery with a deadly weapon and armed burglary, and she was sentenced to 10.5 years in state prison. Dana was convicted on the same charges as Charity, but she received 7.5 years in prison. Heather Wendorf was actually never charged with a crime. She was set free as the state attorney decided not to prosecute her, although many, including Scott, believed that she was the mastermind behind everything. So for the next 2 years, Roderick was the youngest inmate on death row, until November 2000, where the Florida Supreme Court decided to reduce his sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for the others, Charity was released in March in 2006. Dana was released in October of 2011. Scott Anderson was able to get a resentencing on the 3rd of December in 2008, where his sentence was reduced from life in prison to 40 years. So, as it looks like right now, he will be out in 2031. Heather actually disappeared from the public eye rather soon, and the only thing that I was able to find on her was that she had broken off any and all contact with her sister Jennifer. In 2020, the Florida Supreme Court announced that all juveniles who have been sentenced to life without parole must be resentenced, and since Roderick was 16 years old at the time of the crime, there is a chance that Roderick might have his sentence commuted. Roderick also said himself that he believes that everyone deserves a second chance, and if he happens to get out of prison, he has a girlfriend, a house, and a job waiting for him. So yeah, that's it for today's case, and it's a lot to process. Technically, yes, Roderick was only 16 years old, but he started hurting animals way before he committed the double murders. So yeah, I don't know what to think about it. As always, please let me know your thoughts on this case, and also let me know in which case you'd like to see me cover next. I hope I see you all in my next video. Bye!